Good morning. Goldie, thank you very much. Thank you for hosting, and for all of you, thank you for being here today. This is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, as you are probably all aware of, and it's a great opportunity for us to talk about cybersecurity and the things we've done and the things we need to do. But first of all, I want to talk a little bit about something different. Life's all about our experiences, right? I mean, that's what we do, whether they're experiences interacting with people, experiences interacting with environment. And to me, what makes those experiences interesting is the emotions that we get out of them, right? Whether it's excitement or fear or joy or love or loss, life, that's really when, for me, we kind of feel most alive. I love sailing, some of you know that, and one of my favorite moments in life and on a sailboat is the moment you turn the engine off. And you go from this noisy old diesel engine, at least on my boat, and to suddenly this calm, peace, tranquility of just hearing the wind and the waves and the water go by. And so, we all have these different experiences that lead to these emotions, and you can each think about some. Maybe it's cheering for your team that's doing well in the World Series. Go Nats. Go Nats. I mean, you're here, so you might be tired, I understand that, but you're definitely here. But there are a lot of different emotions that we understand. One we don't talk as much about is safety, right? And that feeling of being safe. And it's something that we know, we understand, whether we're in our neighborhood and everything looks familiar, or we're in our house and we're sort of settled in for the day. But we also understand when we don't feel safe, and what is the environment around which we don't necessarily feel safe. And it could be walking in our own neighborhood and seeing a group of people we don't recognize, seeing a car we don't recognize. It could be being in a new city, going out for a walk or a run early in the morning or late at night and realizing, wow, this wasn't the street I should have gone down. And there are indicators. It could be that there's nothing on that street and it just feels creepy. It could be that group of people at the end of the street that make it feel a little creepy, or the beat up car, or the shell casings on the ground. It could be a number of things. And so in the physical world, we have a lot of input to let us know what our surroundings look like. Our virtual world is not quite as transparent. And so when we talk about cybersecurity, it's really how do we get to a place that we actually are relatively safe, or as safe as we can possibly be. And we don't have that feedback, and so it's easy to get to a place of complacency and just assume, well, nothing looks wrong. There's no big, your computer has been encrypted today and all your photos are gone, warning on my computer, so therefore I must be safe. So how do we deal with it when we don't have those indicators from a threat that is very, very real and it's very persistent? And so as Goldie mentioned, a little over a year ago, we put out the National Cyber Strategy. I'm guessing you're familiar with it, but just as a quick recap, it's aligned around the 4 pillars of the National Security Strategy. Pillar 1, which is protect the American people, the homeland, and the American way of life, which is all about federal cybersecurity, critical infrastructure, and cyber crime. By the way, Tanya has the best title later in the day for her talk, so take a look at that from the FBI. Pillar 2, which is promoting American prosperity. So how do we ensure that we have an internet that is a safe place for innovation and the economic growth that it has given us over the last 20 or 30 years? And how do we continue that into the future? Preserving peace through strength is pillar 3. This is about how do we view and how do we leverage cybersecurity as an element of national power, right? We don't do offensive cyber operations to have a cyber effect. We do them because there's a national thing we're trying to accomplish, and cyber might be the appropriate tool. We have other tools, diplomacy, the military and kinetic tools, and a variety of them, and we want our leaders to understand that cyber is just another piece of that. And then pillar 4 is advancing American influence. So how do we increase and advance American influence working with allies and like-minded partners around the world? And so over the last year, since the strategy was put in place, we really focused on how do we implement the 42 priority actions that are identified in the strategy. And we haven't necessarily implemented all of them. Some of them are those things that may never be complete, but we need to continuously work on. But a couple of the big successes I want to highlight for is first and foremost, the President signed into law the creation of DHS's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, almost a year ago, which really gives us an organization that is focused on federal and really critical infrastructure cybersecurity for our nation. And you're going to hear from Chris Krebs, the director of the agency, later today. Within the Office of Management and Budget, we've put out a number of new policies around cybersecurity, specifically a new identity management policy, a new high-value asset policy, which is about how do we identify what is most critical in our environments and be sure that we're protecting it appropriately. And then we've got recently put out a new trusted internet connection policy that gets into guidance for federal agencies on how they can really leverage cloud services and have flexibility to adapt the security profile to the technology as it continues to change. So something that's going to allow us to evolve over time as opposed to being sort of locked in one particular place. Election security, we've had a lot of enhancements on how the interagency works together. I'm confident Chris will talk a little more about that this afternoon as well. But really, what do we do to ensure that Americans have confidence in our electoral system going forward and certainly going into next year's election? Workforce is another area that we've had a number of successes. The President signed an executive order on America's cybersecurity workforce. And two things I want to touch on it. There are a number of activities under that. But first and foremost is the Department of Education has created and established, in accordance with the EO, an Educator of the Year award. So for primary and secondary school, Cyber Educator of the Year Award. They are in the process of taking nominations for that, I think through December. And then next spring during National Education Week, the Department of Education will identify the winners of each of those. So really, how do we enhance that awareness at all levels of our education and all levels of our citizens? Also, for the workforce, the executive order established in the Department of Homeland Security has put into place the President's Cup. And this is a cyber competition, and it's a cyber competition focused on federal agencies, both DoD and civilian and employees. And it is ongoing right now. We've got about 1,000 competitors on 300 teams from 18 different agencies across the federal government that are participating. And then later in December, later this year, we will identify the winners in both the team competitions and the individual competitions. So those are some of the, and then finally, the last item I want to touch on for accomplishments is around supply chain. This is an area that absolutely keeps me up at night. It's an area that I think is going to continues to get and become more challenging for how do we address supply chain management. But two successes we've had. One is an executive order that the President signed that delegated IEPA authorities to the Secretary of Commerce so that he can exercise and basically put into place regulations on the telecommunications industry to identify certain goods and services or products that we think, or the Secretary of Commerce feels, are unacceptable or pose too great of a risk to our national infrastructure. So this is about what's in our telecommunications commercial infrastructure. And then secondly, the President signed the Secure Technologies Act on the day of the government shutdown, December 21st last year, so you might not have heard as much about it. But the Secure Technologies Act created a Federal Acquisition Security Council inside of the Office of Management and Budget that allows us to look at, what is the supply chain of goods and services and items coming into the federal government? What do we think is going to be acceptable? And so this council is put together to do a number of things, to share information across the federal government on supply chain assessments and supply chain risk information. Also, how do we share that information with the private sector? So not just sharing within the government, but how do we share and which information can we share more broadly? We also are kind of one of the main things that we're looking at is establishing a set of criteria by which we will assess individual products or companies or services for their applicability into the federal government. And what the council will do, the council is then charged with making recommendations to the Secretary of Defense, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Secretary of Homeland Security, each of whom are authorized under this legislation to issue exclusion and removal orders. So they can basically take recommendations from the council and issue a removal or exclusion order about their enterprise, right? Whether that's the Secretary of Defense and DoD, the intelligence community, and the broader federal civilian agencies with the Secretary of Homeland Security, and say it is unacceptable, an unacceptable risk to have this equipment or this service inside the federal enterprise. And so that is something that is a new authority being provided to those individuals. And then the other really important part of the legislation is we feel, and more importantly, the Director of National Intelligence feels, that we can leverage classified information in making those determinations and appropriately protect that information. And by protect it, I mean protect it in the ensuing court battles that will take place as we issue removal and exclusion orders. As you may recall, 2 years ago, the Secretary of Homeland Security issued a binding operational directive about Kaspersky products. That was completely based on unclassified information. Had we been able to do that and leverage classified information, we probably could have issued it a year or even 2 years sooner, but we didn't want to leverage classified information and then have to turn that over in a discovery motion as soon as the court cases started, which they of course have on that front. So that's a bit of a touch on where we've been. Priorities for the coming year, they're really similar to a number of the accomplishments that we have. So elections is obviously going to continue to be a priority, continue to be a focus across the interagency. We know there's going to be a lot of attention on that. Secondly, supply chain. So we are kind of at the point where we have tools, we have these mechanisms, we've got to figure out how to use them, right? We've got to actually implement them and be able to make determinations and start building that muscle memory of how we're going to work forward on that and how we're going to actually achieve the outcomes, because I'm a policy guy, so often our success is another policy, but really the successes need to be outcomes and need to be outcome-based. Workforce is a continual issue. It's an issue for the federal government. It's an issue for the nation. How do we ensure that we have the skills we need across the nation in cybersecurity? And how do we ensure that we have awareness around cybersecurity for all our occupations? And so when we talk about cybersecurity awareness, to me, it's less about all of you who probably do some amount of IT or cybersecurity work in your day jobs, but it's really how do we ensure that our general counsels and that our C-suite and that our individual citizens understand cybersecurity, because everyone has a role to play, right? Everyone's got a role to play, whether you're a policymaker, whether you're a developer or a product deliverer or service provider, or if you're an individual citizen. There's a role that everyone needs to play to ensure that we have the security in our virtual environment that we absolutely need. And then fourth priority is identity management. And this is an area we've done a lot inside the federal government about how we deal with our internal, both employees, our contractors, folks that are accessing federal systems. We've got to do a lot more for folks that are leveraging government to citizen services, but also more broadly across the nation. So how do we have an identity management ecosystem that has federation, has interoperability to where you can, present yourself in a virtual environment and present yourself with an amount of authentication to the receiving entity about who you actually are, which doesn't mean you can't be anonymous and watch all the cat videos or, silently root for the Astros if you're going to do that. Those things are allowed, maybe not the Astros piece. But you should be able to be on the internet and be anonymous whenever you want to do that. However, at some point when you want to enter into e-commerce and you want to purchase something, there's an amount of authentication that's needed. Maybe if you just want a copy of your tax returns sent to your address on file, like maybe we don't need to know a lot about you because we're sending it to the to the address that we have on file. But if you want to go in and change the deposit account for your tax return, that's something we really need to have an assurance about who you actually are. So we've got a lot of work to continue to do on identity management, not just from a government standpoint. This is one that absolutely requires a true partnership between the public and private enterprise. So I would ask that you pay attention today. You've got a lot of great opportunities to learn from folks, but I think you will learn as much from the people at your tables today as you probably will from any of us on stage. So take the opportunity, as Goldie said, to meet someone new and really to come up with what is the bold thing that you're going to do when you leave here today. So thank you very much for the time and have a great morning.